Check your clocks.
Check them.
Check your watches.
Are they digital?
Check your dashboards.
Are they analog?
And check your sundial.
Have they been updated since daylight savings time?
What time do you think any of those would show you right now, Josh?
A time to think.
A time to think.
You actually asked me at lunch what time it was, and I got you. I did. What a dumb question to ask me on a Monday while we're recording podcasts. I looked at my watch so sincerely, and I told you it was a time to think.
Yeah, and I actually needed the answer because my watch is dead right now.
Oh.
So
it's a good thing I drove and you didn't, because you would have had warrant to just leave me at the restaurant.
Warrant. 80s rock band.
Wow.
Anyways, this is Pastor Chris Tillman. You are Pastor Josh Holland.
I am Al Pastor. We pastor churches in Central Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and Wausau, respectively, and we get a chance.
In Twin Cities of Central Wisconsin, if you will.
I guess.
About a 25-minute hike between the two.
There's not two super close, highly populated cities, is there, in Central Wisconsin?
No, Mosinee is like the handshake between us. So.
We digress. Welcome to A Time to Think, where we have been in a series talking about the New Testament canon, talking about modern objections to it, talking about why this conversation is relevant to current apologetics. And now we get to talk about what are the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Gnostic with a G, Gnostic, like ganache.
Yeah.
Now, Chris, I've been thinking about gnosis quite a bit.
I'm sure you have.
Because we have a daughter that just turned 1, and she'll try to climb the stairs, and I'll say, "No, sis."
Your daughter is your sister?
We call her sis.
Oh, okay.
She is a sister. I should
are
have
from
led with that.
Tennessee.
I mean, I had this joke played up, and the punchline didn't land because I didn't tell it good.
Well,
we call her sis, and I'm just constantly saying,
okay.
"No, sis. No, sis."
And every listener that is listening, all 3, 4, maybe 10 of them, understand now the context of your joke.
I guess that is the point of A Time to Think, is to help people understand, not necessarily to make them laugh.
Understand your family life.
Yeah.
And why
I do call her
sis.
sis. Gnosis is a different thing, though, because there's a G in it. Yeah, it's gnosis, like ganache. And it...
Gnu. The animal, a gnu.
What is that?
Or a gnome.
A gnome, yeah?
Yeah, a lawn gnome.
Why do we slap G's on the beginning of words? That's not the topic of conversation at hand today. I mentioned gnosis because there are a collection of documents that were found in the 1940s by a gentleman named Muhammad Ali.
Are you serious? That was
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yep.
Okay.
Gentleman named Muhammad Ali.
He floated like a butterfly,
not
and he
the
stung
gentleman.
like a bee.
Yep. No, there were these two brothers, I think they're brothers, that went out digging, and they found this pot, and the story goes, and I've heard this same story from Ehrman and Kruger. It's like the only thing that Bart Ehrman and Michael Kruger agree upon.
Muhammad Ali.
Right. And so, these two brothers go out, they find this earthenware jar, and they're discussing whether or not to open the jar, and they have a debate on whether or not there would be a spirit in this jar that would come out and harm them.
Yeah.
But then there's also, it could be gold. So what is it? Is it a demon or is it gold? Well, it was paper. It was parchment. No, it was papyrus, right? So they opened
the font?
this.
It was in papyrus font.
Yes, they opened this earthenware jar, and it's not gold. It's not a demon. That's good news. It is. I got Chris with that one. Finally, someone laughed. It's not gold. It's not a demon. It's writing and documents. Well, what they didn't realize is they had stumbled upon a collection that's now called the Nag Hammadi Library with a bunch of Gnostic Gospels. Gnostic because they are generally understood to be dated in the mid 2nd century. That would be the 150s.
Yeah.
About 100 years after the life of Jesus, when
earthly life.
Ooh, that'll preach. About 100 years after the earthly life of Jesus, when there started to become a more full-fledged version of something called Gnosticism, right? Now, one of the things that Kruger and Kostenberger have described is that a big difference between Gnosticism as a heresy and Orthodox Christianity is that one of them was uniform, so unified that you could build a church around it.
Yes.
And the other one was so disparate that it's hard to actually define as a grouping, right?
Yep.
Even though that's a challenge, if you had to try to present some threadings that are apparent in forms of Gnosticism, what would you describe?
I would say, to be generous, probably a skepticism of established patterns of thought and belief, because the things that were believed by the Gnostics, and as much as we know about them, were bizarre. Right? They were different. They were not just like variations here and there. They were weird things.
This isn't Marcion saying the Old Testament God's bad.
Which in itself has Gnostic, elements to it.
How so?
Marcion did, because he basically equated the God of the Old Testament with the demiurge, and
Okay.
so that there's some very similar
Okay.
theologies represented there between the God of the Old Testament and Gnosticism and Neoplatonism and all that. But yeah, I mean, so there's a willingness to believe some weird things. I think there's, to draw together for personal experience, that people today have. And before I go into, kind of some of those weird things, is the idea that, I've stumbled upon something unique. I've stumbled upon something that, not everybody understands. Not everybody knows this, but I know this because I've been given a secret kind of knowledge.
Yeah.
But, that's where we get the term Gnostic, which means knowledge. Gnostic thought, that we believe something, we know something that's unique to us. Now, there is, in Christianity, I mean, in any religious system, an idea that there's something unique about what we believe, but Gnosticism has a special appeal that in a particular type of individual.
Well, the big difference between Christianity and Gnosticism in that regard is not that there isn't knowledge that only a certain people know about, but the reason you don't know about the knowledge is way different. In Christianity, the knowledge is clear, right? The divine attributes of God have been manifest since the foundation of the world, and he's spoken in his Son clearly. Well, then why don't everybody know about it? Because their hearts are hardened.
Yes.
And they're blinded. It's not that the truth is even hidden in the sense of you got to be able to go find it. Right.
Yes.
Whereas in Gnosticism, it's you have to be able to, with your own capabilities, go and find it. That's a big difference.
Yeah. So, there's that kind of appeal to, you have a secret bit of knowledge, and there are all kinds of different points we can jump off here to discuss contemporary trends in thought and theology over the past 150 years, how that's materialized.
I mean, enlightenment as salvation is going to be something that's tied to Gnosticism. You are saved not through a sacrificial, substitutionary, atoning death by a man named Jesus.
You're saved by an experience of knowledge that's unique, right? But then, I think finally, just to, tie some things together for people, and you see hints of this we'll call it proto-Gnosticism in the New Testament. John addresses it as he's writing toward the end of the first century in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. The idea that basically it's anti-materialism, matter is bad, and knowledge is good. You see it in Christian Science, which is my old campus director with Crew, Jim Saunder, lovely man. He'd always say, and I does not attribute it only to him, but he would always say, Christian Science is like grape nuts. It's neither grapes nor nuts.
Right.
And Christian Science is neither Christian nor science. So, Christian Science is a similar idea that God is infinite mind and that the material is bad. And so people will not treat physical health issues because the body is just inherently bad. They won't do blood transfusions, different things like that.
Would you describe Gnosticism as dualistic in that way, the separation of kind of spirit and matter?
Absolutely. Absolutely dualism.
Which is why, you might hear the term bandied about in modern day because we are once again separating spirit and matter.
Right.
When people talk about things like, in crass terms, you can sleep around with anyone you want because it's just physical.
Right.
You are
It's just like a handshake, right?
Whereas Christianity says, no, actually, the person who does that sins against their own body. You can't do something physical without it affecting you emotionally as a soul.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians, honor God with your body, glorify God with your body because it doesn't belong to you, right?
So that would be one modern manifestation of the type of thought that separates matter and spirit into two different things.
Yeah. So, those are some basic Gnostic, I guess, qualifications, if you want to look at it that way. Now, it starts filtering in other areas. And to be honest, you even see this, and I don't mean to drag anything through the mud here, but even in the early Pentecostal movement, in the early 1900s, there is a Gnostic tendency where had these Azusa Street revivals where people would be committing some pretty heinous acts, right? So Azusa Street, where you had all of these supposedly great spiritual experiences going on, and people are doing these remarkable spiritual things. And so people will be supposedly speaking in other languages and heavenly languages, and they would be performing, they would be mooing like cows and doing these things that look like spectacular spiritual manifestations. At the same time, racism was rampant in that crowd. There was rampant racism. There was rampant sexual, immorality going on, from what I understand. Within
So you're
that
saying
crowd.
that separates the idea of a spiritual experience from what I'm doing
Right, a
materially.
holistic view of the person, where the whole self is redeemed by Christ. The idea that we can somehow separate magnificent spiritual experience from what happens, in the physical body. That has been a thing, throughout church history. And this is, you get to Marcion, you get to Marcionism, and he was, I guess, a proto-Pentecostal because of the practices he engaged in spiritually. He had two women who would go around with him, and they did prophesy. And this has been happening for a long time, where people have basically compartmentalized, because let's be honest, Josh, it's much easier for us if we want to point to ecstatic spiritual experiences and ecstatic physical experiences and say they really don't have any bearing on one another, because we know that ecstatic physical experiences do sometimes involve sin. I mean, just outright sin. And ecstatic spiritual experiences, well, they're just spiritual, right? And so if somebody says, hey, God spoke to me, God came to me in a vision, and he spoke to me uniquely, well, you can't argue with that, and you can't argue with the physical pleasure that might be experienced by somebody. And so if you hold the trump cards of, my experience and my knowledge and my whatever, it's very difficult to argue with that. And that's, to be honest, as we take a look through church history here and we think about the canon, and we understand the importance of the canon when it comes to qualifying genuine Christian belief, it's in part a response, a necessary response to the human tendency to do this compartmentalization, where we believe that what happens to us physically is divorceable from our spirituality when God created us as body and soul, right?
So you've got a couple tendencies that we're tying here to Gnosticism. One is the idea of secret enlightenment,
Right.
Maybe unto salvation. There's a secret knowledge that you can grasp if you apprehend it, if you recognize it, and then the separation of matter and soul. I actually had one brother who'd been listening to the podcast talk to me last week just about we talked about Docetism, and why would someone want to say, well, Jesus didn't actually come in a body. And my response, you can riff off this or tell me I was wrong in saying this, either way, but my response was that in human history, humans have really struggled to figure out how to mesh matter and soul.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's just been a long-standing conversation of whether or not the material is good or bad, whether or not the material should be escaped or it's all we have.
Yep.
There's just a long-standing issue with matter and spirit.
Yep.
And one of the ways you deal with that is Gnosticism, or other beliefs that all matter is bad. We need to escape the matter and just have some sort of spiritual experience. And the ethical implication of that is because matter is really bad and to be escaped, doesn't always matter what you do with matter.
Right. I see what you did there.
So you can see why people would struggle with or want to deny the idea that God became matter. Right. That, if you're Marcion and you're thinking about the evil demiurge that made this woeful creation, and now you're saying that he became part of it.
Right.
This would really fly in the sensibilities of a lot of Greek thought that did not want to combine matter and the spirit. So that's just a little reflection on what Gnosticism is, because these documents that were found in 1945 are called the Gnostic Gospels because they, in large part, espouse Gnosticism.
Yep.
Now, one interesting thing and one relevant thing. The interesting thing may not be relevant, but I think it's interesting. So Walter Bauer comes out with his thesis that we've talked about in past episodes about the variety of Christian beliefs and how they were equally valid. And therefore, orthodoxy is not the unified strand of Christian thought throughout history. It's just the winners, right?
Right.
That actually came out before the Nag Hammadi documents.
Huh.
So I think it was like 1930s, Bauer writes.
Okay.
1940s, Nag Hammadi gets discovered. So a pretty incredibly interesting historical event there, where a prominent scholar comes out with this thesis that seems to be backed by archaeological evidence, like 10 years later, which historically speaking is not a long period of time
Yeah.
between those two things. So now all of a sudden in modern times, guys like Ehrman or Elaine Pagels have evidence, right? They have not only a theory from Bauer, but 10 years after Bauer, they get tangibility.
Sure.
And so
From
now,
Muhammad Ali.
From Muhammad Ali, yeah. And so now they're able to point to not just an idea, but documents
Yeah.
from the 2nd century, like the Gospel of Thomas or Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. These different, I mean, they're called Gospels, right? There are these different documents that are relatively early dated and seem to cast doubt on the New Testament being the only reliable witness
Sure.
to Jesus. Well, one of the reasons we start off this discussion with a discussion of Gnosticism is because if you just have an overview of even just the idea that you are saved through enlightenment, you will know that that is very different than the Old Testament.
Right.
And that is very different than what is portrayed in the New Testament canon. So at the outset, you know there's a really stark divide here. And then if you combine that with historical dating and you realize that most critical scholars still date the New Testament before 120.
Right.
And a lot of the evidence we have from like an Irenaeus or early church fathers leads us to say there's some sort of unified at least 20 or so books within the first, by like
century.
100 or 120.
Yep.
And then you have these so-called Gnostic Gospels that all happen after that.
Yep.
We know we have historical reason to say there's something theologically different, and they come later.
Right.
Another characteristic, just reading through the Gospel of Thomas, which is really the poster child. And you might have heard of the Gospel of Thomas because of this. It's, I think Elaine Pagels did her work on it. Bart Ehrman loves it. It's kind of the most well-known version of the argument that, see, there are other books that are not included in our New Testament. Mm-hmm. I was just reading through it this morning, and it's very interesting because I would say ballpark 80% of it
It's perfectly normal.
seems like, so in the New Testament, you have a lot of parables and then a lesson.
Right.
Or a story and then a lesson. Now imagine that all you did is take that last sentence from each of the lessons and put it into the Gospel of Thomas.
Sure.
And so he'll say things like, kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed.
Yep.
And you're like, well, that sounds normal.
Yep.
Say things like the least become the greatest. And you're like, well, that sounds a lot like what the other guy says. And so there is a lot of commonality in certain senses. Then every once in a while you hear something like, the kingdom of heaven is inside of you. Mm-hmm. And you're like, I don't think that's what Jesus said. And then you'll hear something else about like, you will be saved into the kingdom if you recognize it.
Sure.
And you're like, oh, that sounds different. And so there's this really interesting structure to it where it's almost like people took the sayings of Jesus and made it like the book of Proverbs. It was like just back to back to back sayings.
Yep.
And then every once in a while there's something that points you towards a different type of salvation. And one of the reasons I reflect on that is because literarily, when something is called a gospel, that means something.
Correct.
A gospel is an announcement. It goes
a
back
record.
to a tradition of kings announcing a victory. A gospel is an announcement. Thomas isn't really an announcement.
No.
There's not much announcement in it at all.
No.
So from the outset, we're dealing with different types of literature. But what does that do when we look at the Gnostic Gospels? Not only is there a different theology, but it's a different type of literature for the most part. How does that play into our view of canon and how we trust the New Testament canon?
So one of the issues with Thomas
My son.
Yes, our children have different issues. That's for sure. Thomas has issues. My kids have issues. All of our kids have issues, but they're not as profound as the issues the Gospel of Thomas has. So
praise the Lord.
Yeah. So what you'll find with these different records that show up, like you said, is there will be overlap. Now, if somebody were to string together the sayings of Josh, right, and they pulled things together, and it's like, yeah, this sounds about right. You could probably construct a reasonable picture of who Josh is. You can do that and say, oh yeah, this sounds like Josh. But when you start operating in the territory of this doesn't sound like Josh, the best thing that you can do is, I guess, let me put it like this. The best thing you can do with things that don't sound like Josh is to put it in with a lot of things that do sound like Josh. Right? And so if you want somebody to believe something about you, let's say I go through I have a concerted effort. I want to make a concerted effort to convince the world that Josh Holland loves wearing pink striped pajamas to bed. Now, I don't think that's true. I could be corrected. You or Morgan could let me
orange
know if that's
pinstripe
true.
would be
okay.
would
Orange
be true.
pin for the Vols.
Pink,
okay,
not so much.
Yeah. So I mean, I could go through a whole list of things and make it say, okay, this is Josh. This is Josh. This is Josh. And then along the way, just say things like, when Josh was 12, he announced to his mother his favorite color was pink. Well, that sounds kind of reasonable, right?
Yeah.
And along the way, I could say something like, and when Josh and Morgan got married, Josh said, it's important that I'm able to wear pajamas, like just different things that can kind of come in along the way. And when you put it all together, you're like, this doesn't seem like it's actually communicating consistently. It seems like there's something that's getting threaded in here. It's kind of like you have a shirt and everything seems about fine for that shirt, but there are just these couple of strands of thread that are showing up like this just doesn't seem like it fits in with the shirt. I mean, it makes sense that there would be a shirt that has threads in it, but these threads don't seem to line up. Mm-hmm. And with the other gospel records, what you find is, and what's funny is even in critical scholarship, you'll get people who will talk about Q, right? Source text and what Q is for those who are interested, or maybe you're not interested, but I'll just tell you anyways. Q is the idea.
That's the purpose of a time to think. Maybe you're not interested, but we're going to tell you anyways.
Exactly.
Get some T-shirts.
But Q is this posited source that critical scholars believe that Matthew or Mark or Luke would have drawn material from. Now,
because there's overlap in
right, because there's overlap.
Gospels.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we call them synoptic gospels. So they're things that they work together effectively. There's really not a different picture painted. But what you do want to realize is that there was diversity in the gospel records, not diversity of actual material, diversity of perspective. And so when you look at Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, you find 4 records, and these are well attested early in the church. I mean, this was like the non-contested realities of the first century was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is, there was, I think, even images people used, like 4-headed images of saying, the Gospel of Matthew had the head of this, and the Gospel of Mark had the head of this. Not, some kind of weird way, but just saying.
Irenaeus is well known for saying it's a bad logical argument, but he's well known for saying that as there are 4 winds and 4 corners of the earth, there are 4 gospels. And
yes,
we don't have 4 gospels because there are 4 corners of the earth, but the idea is
it was
by
accepted.
Irenaeus, early 100s, it was so clear that there were 4 gospels.
Exactly.
It was as if it was from the creation of the world.
Exactly. And so, when you start seeing this other stuff materialize, you're like, okay, well, first of all, what I want to portray myself as being in that stream of thought, if I want to present divergent ideas, well, of course I would. I mean, and so it's not a surprise if somebody wants to start attaching ideas like, oh, this is the gospel of so-and-so, and then put a name on it, pseudepigraphical, that's what we call it, false names attached to these things, saying, oh, well, if Thomas, the apostle, wrote something down, well, surely we should want to listen to it. Well, the problem is, it's out of bounds, right? On multiple levels, it's out of bounds with content, out of bounds with authorship, out of bounds with timing, all these different types of things. But, it's really not a gospel record because you look at what happens in the other gospel records. The gospel records are providing perspectives on what happened in the, earthly life, death, ministry, resurrection of Jesus. But you get to these other things and it's like, this just doesn't fit. This just doesn't work here because this is not showing up the way these other things are. So.
There's a really simple principle here that I think Christians should employ whenever we can, which is read them.
Right.
And have others read them.
Yep.
And it's really simple because it's as simple as reading. I mean, you can read the Gospel of Thomas in 15 minutes. And Kruger, in his kind of paradigm of how we know New Testament canon, talks about corporate reception, so the community generally receiving. He helpfully notes that like Irenaeus and the first couple hundred years basically says, hey, there's like 22 books that no one disagrees on. There's 5 that are disputed.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, 200 years later, you have Eusebius saying, there's 22 books that no one disagrees on. There's about 5 that are disputed. And you're like, oh, it's the same 22 over 200 years. There's some consistency here. And I think Eusebius has what he sees as undisputed books and then disputed books, and that makes up our New Testament canon.
Correct.
There are no books that Eusebius in the early 300s or late 200s sees as disputed that aren't actually in the canon.
Correct.
Because he has another category for ones that aren't.
That
which
are
is
out of
called
bounds.
Spurious.
Yes.
Spurious is like, I mean, there's some good stuff in there, but it's not canon. And then he has a fourth category, which is, it's like wickedness.
This is nuts, right? Exactly.
It's like, and in the spurious category, I think he calls them mixed. Like, there's some good stuff in here,
Shepherd
but it's
of
not
Hermas,
canon.
is that in that?
I think Shepherd would be spurious. But then Thomas is in the don't touch this category.
This is nuts, yeah.
Right? It's in the MC Hammer category.
You can't touch
And so why that's important is because the early church read these and saw them as so categorically different.
Yeah.
And we can do the same thing now, right?
Yep.
And, you know, C.S. Lewis, there's a little essay, I guess it was a speech, but you can read it as an essay that you can look up called, I think, Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. You can find it by Lewis online, Modern Theology, Biblical Criticism. And it's enjoyable because he's really funny. He kind of plays dumb, and he's not dumb. And he starts off, he's addressing, I think, a theological school in the UK, maybe affiliated with the Church of England.
Okay.
And he says, you know, I was with your principal the other night, and I said too much. You know how you speak freely after dinner. And I spoke way too much and probably said things I shouldn't say. And then your principal said, well, you should say those to my students. And so that's like the introduction.
Okay.
And then he kind of plays this role of just a sheep. He's a bleating sheep is what he calls himself.
Okay.
He's like, you know, I'm not theologically trained like you all or the academics. I'm just a sheep, but here's a few bleats. Here's a few thoughts. And, you know, C.S. Lewis, before he was a Christian, was a literary scholar. So he knows a lot about reading literature. And one of the things he says is, academics tell me that they can read between the lines of a document to see what's really there. And they prove this to me by not being able to read the lines themselves.
Oh, wow.
These are daggers, but there's a core truth there.
Yep.
Like, modern scholars in a non-believing academia try to suppose that they can see what's really there. The Jesus that's really behind the gospel is what they're actually saying. But then you just read it. You're like, that's not what the lines say.
Exactly.
There's a simple human rationality that anyone who's literate can employ to read Matthew and then to read the Gospel of Thomas and go, these are fundamentally different.
Yep.
And if one of them is written 100 years later by someone who's lying because they're claiming to be an apostle and they historically can't be because they're living after the time of the apostles, well, then, and it's categorically different, and it's espousing a theology that really didn't come into full form until the 2nd century, and we know Jesus was 1st century. There's just a rationality in saying, let me give priority to the earlier documents that are in line with others of their type, written by apostles. And so I love that line, you know, tell me that they can read between the lines, and they prove it by not being able to read the lines themselves.
That's fantastic.
I bring that up because if someone were to say, well, there are other gospels that are not included, read them it really doesn't take long to read Thomas. And one thing you'll see is it's not like the narrative accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's disjointed.
Right.
Yep.
Another thing you'll see is there's some weird stuff in there, particularly the very last line. Are you familiar with the last line of the Gospel of Thomas?
About women?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's, for a modern feminist movement, it's a terrible line.
Yeah, I'm surprised Elaine Pagels actually wants to legitimize that in one level.
So story on that. So the last line, summarizing it, basically says, in order to be saved, men must become women.
Women must become men.
Women must become men. Thank you for,
Yes.
And so the idea is you got to become male in order to enter the kingdom. So obviously, not only to a modern feminist audience, but to anyone who knows that from the beginning God created them male and female, that's wackadoodle.
Seems a little weird.
Right? Well, Michael Kruger shares this story about how there was a really big church in town that would bring critical scholars to town once a year. And he would take his Gospels class or whatever to this critical scholar. It was kind of a learning experience. And he said, Elaine Poggles came. She's written on the Gospel of Thomas. That's kind of her.
Is Elaine Poggles at Harvard?
Was she Princeton?
Okay, one of the, yeah. Okay, sure.
So she comes and she gives a lecture on the Gospel of Thomas, and Kruger says he kind of pokes the student to the side of him, says, ask a question. And the student's like, what do I ask? And he goes, I'll give you a question. So the student raises his hand and says, what do you think about saying 114 in the Gospel of Thomas? And Kruger says, Poggles responds by not really addressing it, and then eventually saying, well, I just don't think that was originally there. and so Kruger's point is that she kind of evades it and then says, well, I effectively choose to believe that wasn't in the original document without any historical validity for that claim. Now, this is not just to make fun of someone. This points out a flaw that a lot of modern critical scholarship has. And it's a dynamic of rationalism and irrationalism. And so this is something that John Frame points out in his apologetics book, that a lot of people have a rationalistic bent, and they say, human autonomy, human reason can figure all of this out. But then there's always some irrationalism.
Yep.
All right. So like the Big Bang Theory, it's like rationalism. We can figure this out. Science explains it. And then you're like, well, how did a universe where energy cannot be created or destroyed start by energy being created? And it's like, well,
don't ask that question.
It happened.
Right,
like
exactly.
I was reading on theistic evolution, and there's something called biogenesis. And biogenesis, effectively, life begets life.
Right.
Well, where did biogenesis start? A lot of evolutionary scientists say it started with abiogenesis,
right,
which was non-life creating life, and then it's just never happened since then.
Yep.
That's irrational, right? And so when we're talking to someone that doesn't have a theologically consistent view, we would say the Bible is the only theologically consistent view. You look for elements of irrationalism. Where that connects to this idea of the Gospel of Thomas is if you've got someone who is trying to use this idea of rationalism in history, really we're just looking at other documents that are around the same time, and then at the moment where it's inconvenient, brings in irrationalism. Well, even though I have no evidence for this, that probably wasn't in the original document. And that just kind of shows the cards a little bit of what you have to do. Right? Any thoughts on that rationalism, irrationalism, or that move?
Yeah, I think I used to be more bothered by this as a younger man. And I want to be clear about one thing here. I'm a millennial. In the car, Josh called me a Gen Xer.
I thought you were going to be so serious there for a second.
No, this is a serious topic, Josh. It's a very serious topic. Serious topic because I don't like getting old.
Yeah.
Anyways, all right. So where was I going with this?
Something about a younger man. You were hot and bothered.
Yes, exactly. I used to be more bothered by these types of things when I was younger because I felt the compulsion to try to correct and address and get all of these things straightened out for other people, basically. But I've learned as I have gotten older, I've learned that it's just ridiculous. Okay, it's ridiculous, and I think the ridiculousness of it is helpful to point out for Christian people who do feel bothered by these things, because when you encounter that type of a response, all right, now Elaine Poggles is a quote scholar, okay, a number of people of her ilk, Jesus Seminar, people who basically decided Jesus must have said these things, or he could have said these things. He didn't say these things. These are the things that a lot of modern scholarship, at least in critical scholarship, are built upon. And what's funny is that it's a house of cards if you really look at it seriously. And you think, okay, now you're telling me that with certainty, with confidence, Jesus said these things. How? How do you know this? Well, we believe that's what he said. And so it's really a laughable thing, not because we want to make fun of people, but it's laughable because with great certainty, people make assertions, and I'm just kind of like going into the practice of how rational, irrational behavior plays out for people so that they don't need to feel so rattled when they hear these types of assertions, because it's like, okay, yes, Jesus certainly said this, but he couldn't have said this. And on what basis? I have these types of conversations evangelistically with people. and I'll talk with people and share the gospel, and then they'll say things like, "Well, I don't think Jesus really said that." Now, this is street level conversation. This isn't an academic conversation, but it's the exact same thing, because what it's simply betraying is you don't think he said it. You don't want him to say it, basically. And so if you want to make your stock and trade the Gnostic Gospels, well, if something is
or it betrays that your ground for deciding, it's maybe to put exactly what you said in a different way. Your ground for deciding what he did or did not say is what you want.
Is you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not a historical ground. It's not a rational ground even. It's a subjective ground.
Exactly. And so it's helpful for us if we're going to examine where people are coming from and their assessments of biblical material. And again, it's not just academic. These are conversations that people have on the street all the time when they say, well, what do you think about Jesus? And you just ask, what do you think about Jesus? And, you might point to certain passages in the Bible and say, well, I don't think he said that. It's like, on what basis? And when you hear the same type of argumentation employed by somebody who has Ivy League degrees under their belt, what it's really pointing you to is the fact that this is not the enterprise of individuals who are necessarily looking for truth. This is an enterprise of individuals who believe they have truth and they want to advance their particular position. Now, all we're saying from our perspective is to say, we believe that we have the true record of what God has spoken to us in his word. But we're honest enough to say that. We talked about this in previous weeks, that we're honest enough to say that we believe this to be true, and here are the reasons why we believe it to be true. But when you can just kind of, through some type of a fiat, say, well, pay no attention to that because I don't think it's original, that should tip somebody off right away that there's both disingenuousness and not just the disingenuousness, but also basically a failure to communicate with any kind of clarity what your position actually is. Mm-hmm. Because all your position really is to undermine that. And that's ultimately, when we talk about Bauer Ehrman, what it really comes down to is it's an undermining hypothesis. We want to undermine the idea that we can know God's word certainly, and we can know that we can know that we don't know so much that when something is presented to us that we believe undermines the not knowing, but it's clear that it says something that is concrete. We can say we don't know we know that that's not there because we don't want it to be. It's just this bizarre house of cards that's constructed for people. And I just really encourage, the average Christian person who's having conversations with people to understand, like, there's good reason to believe what we do believe about Scripture, and that whatever you hear from people, ultimately, you're going to boil it down to these types of statements like, well, it's just not there. And you can't do that. It's not genuine.
Yeah, and so not only to point out, just one of the reasons you point out the holes in the argument. Once again, I think we talked about this last podcast. Give Christians confidence.
Right.
Okay. If you hear someone bandied about, there are other gospels, and you're like, "Oh no, I didn't know that." He's like, "It's okay."
Right.
It's okay. They're not actually. For the most part, I think Peter is a little bit more narrative. They're not actually gospels. They're not narratives in the way that we see Matthew, Mark, Luke. They're different types of literature. They're written late, so believer have confidence. It's okay. And then number two, it's believer have ammunition, so that you can prove to the next person that this is a rational point. Right? We're actually, when we say we have the witness of God, we're actually looking at the documents that were written by people commissioned by Jesus, or sidekicks of the people commissioned by Jesus,
authorized through that
within a certain time period. There's a rationality to why we prioritize certain books over others. And I think that points us to a principle here, Chris. Like in the modern age, we have to help people be equitably skeptical. They need to be equitable in their skepticism.
Sure.
And so if a person is going to have a skepticism that looks at the Gospels and says, man, there's contradictions there. There's a skepticism there, right? I can't trust these four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because they seem to contradict. We have to help them be equally skeptical of the Gospel of Thomas.
Correct.
Like if you're going to apply a certain measure of doubt to one thing, just make sure you apply the same measure to the other thing. And when we can do that, that I think opens the door to continue to present Christianity as more rational.
Right.
There are less reasons to be skeptical about this one than there are about this one.
Correct.
And I think that the modern critical movement wants you to say there's more reasons to be skeptical of the New Testament books we have.
Yep.
But when you actually read, I I think like it's, I might misparaphrase here, but when the Gospel of Peter portrays the kind of the exit of the tomb of Jesus,
Okay.
and has just this fanciful account of, Kruger calls him Godzilla Jesus because he's enormous, just way too big, and I think the cross is like following Jesus out of the tomb.
Sure. Yep.
The reason I bring that up is because if you just read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus dies, and then it's a couple of days later, and then he's not in the tomb,
Right.
and it's oddly normal. Like if you were making up a story about the resurrection,
I mean, yeah, exactly.
you're gonna make up a story about the resurrection, but the Gospels present this.
Matter of factness.
Yeah. So, and there was an angel there. I mean, the angel is supernatural, obviously, but the angel was there, told them he's not here. He's risen. And then you read the Gnostic Gospels, and one of the things that Kruger points out is they're often trying to fill in the gaps left by the true Gospels. Mm-hmm. So, man, something got you. You're failing to hold it together over there.
It's Godzilla.
That was not original to me. So I think it's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Has a lot of stuff about Jesus' childhood.
Yes.
Now,
in
which
Egypt and
which of us hasn't thought, did Jesus disobey his parents? Like, okay, he's perfect. He never sinned as an adult, but what was he like as a toddler?
Sure.
Right? That we have
Did he create pigeons out of clay and bring them to life? And
so we have these curiosities, and you might have thought, like, what was it like when he rose from the tomb, and how did he get the stone rolled away? And the infancy gospel, or the infancy gospel of Thomas and the gospel of Peter, tries to fill in those thought gaps. Right. And it makes it, I mean, you shared the pigeon story, right? It's like this creation of life and then this taking of life. And it's just these fanciful accounts that fill in gaps in the gospel narrative. And what's more rational? That those are the true accounts of what happened, or that those are later accounts of people who are filling in the gaps of things. And here's where filling in the gaps matters, because some of the Gnostic Gospels will take those moments that are not recorded in the true four and have like, these are the resurrection sayings of Jesus.
Sure.
So there was this secret time that's not recorded where Jesus said these things, secret knowledge, right? Yep. And it goes back to this idea of like, there's more. Mm-hmm. There's more that's secret, that's hidden, that he really revealed during this time period. Yep. And the Christian says, no, Jesus revealed what he revealed, and we don't have that much about his childhood. But that's not really what the gospel accounts were pushing towards.
Exactly.
There's a reason they spend an inordinate amount of time on Passion Week and not on his childhood. Yep. Because the gospel accounts are pushing towards an atonement. Any further thoughts on the validity of knowing the theological differences of these gospels, or how to respond to people if they bring up the idea of these Gnostic gospels?
Yeah, it's not only with the gospel records themselves, but if you go into other New Testament texts and you think, all right, we can assemble, and here's what's really kind of bizarre. Charles Darwin had a degree of honesty about himself when he said, within X number of years, my theories about macroevolution, I'm using that word personally, macroevolution, will be borne out by the discipline of paleontology, right? So paleontology had not really been a thing in world history to that point, right? So we are under the impression from Darwin himself that he was so convinced that his theories about evolution and what we call transitional forms, that this would be borne out throughout the process of discovery, excavating the world, all this kind of business, right? Now, Darwin was wrong. He was very wrong. I mean, on multiple levels.
We'll talk about that on A Time to Think in a few.
Yeah,
few
exactly.
episodes.
We'll be talking about that yeah, he was very wrong. And so he was wrong, but he was wrong scientifically, right? So we kind of set aside the whole idea about the special creation of man and the age of the earth and everything like that. It's like paleontology has never found these transitional forms he spoke of. And so if you were to present the evidence to him, he would have had to say, okay, well, yeah, I guess it didn't quite work out the way I planned. What's interesting about these issues of certainty and the gospel records versus Gnostic accounts, these types of things, to say we do have transitional forms, right? We do have records from the 1st and 2nd century that have been around for a long time, at least in terms of our accessibility to them. We haven't needed the internet to encounter early church fathers. We haven't needed that, right? We have records. And whatever one might say about might makes right or anything, I mean, then that's bogus, right? Because you have early church fathers who are being killed.
Right.
These are not powerful men. These are old men who are being
makes
crucified.
right didn't work for Polycarp.
Exactly. I mean, the man is devoured in an arena. I mean, this is not exactly the record of the mighty in Roman culture. We have records. We have writings that are clear about what the church's theology was in the 1st century, what it was in the 2nd century. And even aberrations that we see starting to develop are aberrations we see starting to develop. I mean, I remember being in my first church history class almost 20 years ago at RTS, and we had to read, I think it was, Eusebius' History of the Church. And you read through there and you're like, wait a sec. He acknowledged Peter being a married man and that the church just basically outright said prohibition of marriage among priests is bad news. You should not do that, okay? This is in Eusebius. This is a couple hundred years after Peter's walking the earth. And it's like, all right, so we can trace throughout the history of the church aberrant theology as it develops because people have left records. And we can go, we don't even need to rely, we should, but we don't need to rely on the New Testament texts themselves because of what's being played out in front of our eyes in the history of the church. And so we think, all right, let's say we encounter the Gospel of Thomas. Let's say we encounter the Gospel of Mary. It seems a little weird. Oh boy, should we have our confidence shaken? It's like, we have 2,000 years of not just New Testament autograph, but we have 2,000 years of the church saying, even with a multiplicity of views in certain areas, saying, yeah, this is what the church believes on these particular matters. So it's like, it's pretty crazy to me that 2,000 years after the fact, you can have people say with absolute confidence, the church was wrong. Now, again, theological positions, there's been debate over that, but we know there's been debate, right?
Yeah.
We know there was a debate at Nicaea. Debate over the divinity of Jesus. We know there was a debate. We know what the debate was over. People kept records. And again, this is not because of powerful individuals, okay? Athanasius, not a powerful guy. On one level he is, but the dude gets exiled multiple times over, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of things that we see over the history of the church that are traceable, discernible, easily seen. And so when we encounter these types of documents, what we have to be willing to do is say, look, there would be a record. If this was legitimate, if the church believed this with any degree of seriousness, it would show up more than a pot found by a guy named Muhammad Ali, right?
Yeah. Because Jews and then Christians are scribal people.
Right,
I think
exactly.
I think the book, where we'll get in a few episodes, the book ends with kind of scribal tradition and how things were translated and how manuscripts were guarded and kept. And that's going to be a helpful discussion because it's just going to build the validity of, you'll hear things like there are more errors in the New Testament, right? And the truth of that is if there are thousands of errors in the New Testament manuscripts we possess, most of them are commas or slightly misspelled words. And to your point about records being kept, one of the reasons we know that an error is an error and
so we
not
have a lot of other documents.
Yeah, right. So if you have 500 documents and one of them seems to be an error, you know it's an error because it doesn't match the other documents because it's like, oh, what's 499 to 1? That seems like maybe the comma was misplaced or the word was misspelled. We know the errors are errors because of the wealth of evidence we have, which would kind of be analogous to your point that if there was some sort of, let's call it a council in the late 100s to discuss whether Thomas was part of the canon, we'd probably have something.
We'd know about it.
Because the Christians were a documenting people. And I think Kruger has said in other literature that the movement from a scroll, which you roll up and you write on one side so that you protect the ink, it's not written on the back, the movement from a scroll to a codex, which is the kind of books we read now. It's printed on both sides, folded in half. That was it was most likely a Christian movement to get to that type of documentation because they wanted to be able to house the four Gospels together. And that's just a small piece of evidence that the Christians were a scribal people.
Right.
They took pains to write things down.
It was oral out of necessity, but not out of desire necessarily, right? I mean, people wanted the copy of the writings, right? They were circulated.
There's probably a reason why most of the New Testament is dated to the 60s, because it's the end of the apostolic era.
Right.
Like the Apostle Paul is dying. Yep. Most people other than John are dying.
Yep.
And so they're writing. They're taking this oral testimony that they have guarded and kept, and they're documenting it. And so that's just another piece in the defense of the Christians as a documenting people. Just building this case that there's an irrationality to claiming that because we have documents that are written much later than the New Testament, that are much different than the New Testament, both in form and content, that just because we even possess them at all, there should be doubt about the New Testament.
Right.
The rational conclusion here would be to say, if we look at the earliest things we got, written by the most reliable witnesses that we have, that possess qualities that do not fancify things or don't seem to be just out of bounds in certain categories, then we would rely on the New Testament. That's a rational position. And I'll go back to something I said earlier. Like sometimes the answer for not for your academic, but for your non-believing friend is just, can we read these together?
Yep.
One, because you can help them see the difference in literary quality, but two, because we also believe as Christians that the Lord works through his word, not just through the rationality of arguments, but actually people beholding Jesus and the divine qualities in Scripture by actually reading it.
Yep.
So that's probably the lesson that pastorally I would leave from the discussion of the Gnostic Gospels is read them, see that they're pretty weird, help someone else see that they're pretty weird,
and move on.
Help someone see the beauty of the kind of normalcy of the four Gospels and how they're simply presenting the life, death, resurrection of Jesus in a way that's not overdoing it, you know? So that would be a discussion of the Gnostic Gospels. And we're getting toward the end of Kruger and Kossenberger's books. We're going to talk about some scribal traditions, manuscripts, and then I think we'll probably move on to maybe a larger discussion of apologetics, moving from canon to some of these bigger questions about problem of evil and the nature of God, just as we continue to try to build confidence as Christians and the ability to engage with non-believers. This has been a time to hear Chris think and laugh, and a time to hear me think too and make Chris laugh. See you next time on A Time to Think.